Prime Minister Mark Carney is expected to brief Canada's premiers today on his seemingly successful first meeting with U.S. President Donald Trump yesterday at the White House.
So Carney and Trump spent 2 hours together yesterday, including half an hour in front of the cameras at the Oval Office and then a private lunch afterwards. So let's talk more about this with Scott Reid, principal at Scott Reid, and of course CTV News political commentator who we turn to regularly for things like this. So Scott, I know you've talked a lot about this already, but maybe many people in our audience didn't catch you yesterday here. Things seem to go reasonably, relatively well at the White House yesterday. What's your assessment of how Carney did and what this means for the Canada-U.S. relations?
Well, the second part's the tougher question. I think by almost all accounts, the Prime Minister carefully threaded that needle of standing up firmly to Donald Trump, particularly when he would speak belligerently about Canada being a 51st state, and at the same time, keeping the meeting and keeping the talks on track. So, you know, he goes in there, he knows that this is going to arise, this threat of Canada becoming a 51st state, the president's ambitions to annex Canada, rewrite our border. He literally talked about how silly our border is. Somebody drew it with a straight ruler. By the way, it's not a straight line. I don't know if anybody's ever pointed this out to him. And in any event, I think that Carney carefully navigated that. It was very shrewd when he said, listen, he flattered the president. You're a real estate mogul. No one knows better than you. Some things aren't for sale, and we're not for sale. And I thought the president came ready to let that ride. He could have reacted more confrontationally, and he chose not to. I think there was a real sense that the president says, okay, I've got a new cat on my hands here in this Mark Carney guy. He's a figure of international prominence, given the roles he's held in the past. I want his approval. You know, the psychology of Donald Trump. I'll defer to this guy. I'll be polite with this guy. And so that first task passed.
Yeah, and it was interesting, you know, how when Trump was asked, well, what do you want out of this if you don't want anything from Canada, cars, electricity, whatever, and Trump said, well, friendship. So does that kind of mark an amicable beginning to this relationship? I know, you know, nothing's been set in stone. There was no blow up, but also no breakthrough. So does this kind of set the tone for where Carney wants to go with President Trump?
You'll remember that breakfast meeting a couple years ago, Jen, where you and I and Nick sat around and decided to negotiate whether or not we would be friends. And so you can understand that people would want to negotiate friendship. Look, you know, I think the real question is what is going to concretely come ahead. Imagine you're on the third line at Windsor and you've been laid off. Or imagine you're in Oshawa wondering if your job is going to be secure 6 months down the road. You are impatient for results. You are impatient for correction. And I guess the one thing I would say is it was too much to expect that we would have a program of action and activity coming out of yesterday. But I do think we're going to want to start to look for that. And my hope, and I do think this is Canada's hope, the government's hope, is that Donald Trump is hurting. His poll numbers are down. His people's confidence in his management of the economy is down. Jobs are down. Growth is down. Trade numbers are down. And this is all a consequence of his self-inflicted wound on this terrorist policy. So maybe there's an opportunity. Maybe Donald Trump will see that's in his self-interest to structure a better program going forward with his number one trading partner, which is Canada. But we don't know that yet.
Yeah, and it was interesting to see, you know, last night the White House put out a kind of 30-second recap, almost hype video about that meeting, which was a significant sort of step forward, I would seem. And also, you know, let's pick up on this, Scott. Yesterday when you were on air with us, that it coincided with Premier Doug Ford really kind of taking some shots that we knew Mark Carney wouldn't take at U.S. President Donald Trump. And then after the meeting, Doug Ford really praised the job Mark Carney did. And he's going to be sitting around this virtual meeting today with the Prime Minister. What do you think that conversation is going to be like now that not only Mark Carney is sort of like elected in an election, first sort of meeting of premiers, and then there's the whole Alberta situation too?
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. I think all eyes are going to turn toward Danielle Smith. I mean, she's talking about Western separation. She's talking about lowering the threshold to trigger a referendum on Western separation. And when Doug Ford gave her a little bit of the business yesterday in that very same interview that we watched, she responded yesterday afternoon by saying, I don't tell him how to run Ontario. So, you know, we'll see in the meeting with the premiers whether Danielle Smith says, not good enough, I want results immediately, I want an ironclad commitment that energy will never be on the bargaining table. She's not going to get that. But again, I think overwhelmingly premiers, whether they're Conservatives, Liberals, or New Democrats, are going to be following Doug Ford's lead, which is, you know what? Thank goodness we got past this first meeting with the Mad King. King Joffrey didn't behead anyone. So let's see if we can somehow move forward, build something constructive, and maybe it will help the people in Quebec, the people in Ontario, and yes, the people in Alberta. I think that's going to be the tone from premiers, because everyone knows dealing with this guy is like wrestling with a bear. You just don't know what's going to happen next.
No, and you don't want to end up like Leonardo DiCaprio, or maybe you do because he survived that. Scott Reid, I love the analogies. King Joffrey, Game of Thrones. I got to hand it to you. Good stuff. Thank you so much, Scott.
That's why he's our political commentator.
We'll chat again tomorrow.
Off to Westeros. Thanks, Scott.